Hey everyone. Welcome to the last of the 3 sessions of the Fall MRS Wellness Workshop. This is going to be a workshop on mental health with Dr. Wendy Ingram from Dragonfly Mental Health. I'm Rachel. I'm a grad student at UC Berkeley studying materials for solar energy, and I'm one of the organizers for this symposium. So, as we've seen at this virtual conference so far, academia and materials science research can be amazing and uplifting, but I know firsthand it can also be incredibly stressful and even traumatic. And this has only been exacerbated this year by the pandemic, which has shown a spotlight on some of the deep structural cracks in our academic system. However, rarely do we actually talk openly and honestly about mental health, and especially at academic conferences. So for the system to change, at the very least, our conversation has to change. So our intention of this 3-part symposium, here we go, has been to acknowledge these challenges in a public forum and identify their root causes in order to move forward to create a more supportive and sustainable research environment. So before getting started, I want to thank all the other organizers. So Simi, Araceli, Julia, Professor Eva Hemmer, and Pam, as well as MRS for giving us this platform to talk about mental health and wellness publicly, well, I guess virtually, at this year's conference. So on this slide, it shows the 3 different events we've done. So the first event in this symposium on Monday was a webinar with Professor Yvette Flores about the compounding effects of COVID and mental health, in particular for members of marginalized communities. And the second event was a panel on international experiences in STEM and some of the unique challenges faced by international academics. I invite you to check out the recordings from those talks, and we want to thank our previous speakers for so candidly and courageously sharing their personal experiences. So now in this workshop, we'll take a somewhat more interactive approach, keeping in mind the question, how can we work together to actively create a more supportive research environment? Whoops. So in this event, we'll start with a primer on the state of mental health in STEM and academia from Dr. Wendy Ingram, who I'll introduce in a moment. And then we'll break into small groups to reflect on a set of questions. And then at the end, we'll use these ideas to create a roadmap moving forward to empower ourselves and to catalyze a healthier research culture and community, and then some Q&A and some resources. So some quick logistics before I introduce our amazing speaker. So for those of you watching live, we're going to attempt to make this as interactive as possible, given this virtual Zoom webinar situation. So we'll have polling questions pop up as we go. We actually have some polling questions right now. If you want to go fill them out, just navigate to the polls section of the conference website to fill those out. If you have questions for Dr. Ingram as we go, please add them to the chat box on the conference app or on Zoom, and we can address them at the end of the workshop. You can also add them through the poll feature, which is down here in number 3. And that way your questions will be anonymous. So if you don't want your name popping up with them. And so lastly, for those of you watching the recording later on in the conference app, you can still participate in the polls and you can still add to the chat. So feel free to do so. Okay, so when we started organizing this event and looking for speakers, we wished that we could find a speaker who wasn't just an expert in mental health, but who also had personal experience getting a PhD in science and who could speak directly about mental health challenges within academia and STEM. But we actually had no idea if such a person even existed. And even if so, where they were hiding in virtual land in 2020. So then I sort of serendipitously, randomly happened to check my pile of mailing listserv emails one day, and I found a seminar by Dr. Wendy Ingram at Berkeley Lab about academia and mental health. So of course I watched it and caught myself saying out loud from my quarantine desk, "Oh my gosh, what?" Or or "Oh wow, that's a really good idea." And so I kind of felt shocked, shocked about the statistics we're up against, affirmed about how I've been feeling, from her talk and also inspired by the prospect of cultural change. So I knew we'd found the perfect speaker to welcome to MRS. All right, so I'll stop talking soon, but now it's my honor to introduce our speaker for this workshop, Dr. Wendy Marie Ingram. Dr. Ingram is the founder and CEO of Dragonfly Mental Health, which is a nonprofit dedicated to cultivating excellent mental health among scientists and academics around the world. She is a trained molecular and cell biologist who earned her PhD from UC Berkeley in 2015 and completed a postdoc in psychiatric epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. As a researcher, she uses biomedical informatics to understand the underlying biology of mental illness. And through her advocacy work at Dragonfly, she collaborates with others around the world to dismantle the stigma against these illnesses through research, education, and systemic change initiatives. So she's going to talk all about that momentarily. With that, we are so delighted to welcome Dr. Ingram to share her expertise with the MRS community. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's really a pleasure, and I'm so glad that our earlier presentations are now leading us to spread the word and engage with more communities to help create the change we need in academia. So pardon me a moment while I share my screen and try to get it to do the right things. So hopefully everyone can see just my slides. Can I get a thumbs up from Rachel if it looks right? Awesome. Okay. So we're going to have an interesting talk today that I think that I hope will be really engaging. And so what I'm going to do is initially start out with mental health talk. I have a little bit of an outline. I'll go into a little more detail of what's included in the talk, and then what we'll do from there so you know what to expect when. So to start, I wanted to first just take a moment and so we are talking about mental health. We are going to be talking about serious mental health diseases and conditions. So sometimes these things can be triggering, or they can bring up emotions in people, or remind people of maybe people they've lost. I've lost some folks to mental illness. So if you find yourself in crisis or in need of some kind of emergency support, we've got a potentially very wide audience here, so I'm not sure where you are, but if you're in crisis or need emergency support, I recommend going to this website, iasp.info/resources/crisis_centers. This is a worldwide list, so irrelevant of where you are, you should be able to find something that's local for you. I do want to also begin with a disclaimer. So while I am a mental health researcher and expert in that regard, I'm not a mental health provider, nor, if I was, does Dragonfly provide any healthcare or medical advice. So this information that we're providing today does not qualify as personal medical advice and does not substitute for speaking to medical professionals. So if anything kind of piques your interest or sounds familiar to you, I highly recommend taking the time, taking advantage of your local resources to get connected to a clinician to discuss a little more detail. So the outline for this morning's talk, I'm in California, so it's pretty early morning for me. We're gonna talk, I'll do a personal introduction, and I'm saving more information about Dragonfly mental health for the end during the larger group discussion, in case we wanted to engage on a little bit more about what we do, what we offer, how we engage with communities. I'm gonna briefly point out what this talk is meant to be and what it's not. And I'll introduce the idea of the mental health spectrum. Where then the bulk of the talk is going to be a brief overview of some mental illnesses. So we have very limited time here. We really can't go into extensive detail. If in the discussion, you would like to dig a little deeper, learn a little bit more about particular illnesses or disorders that we're going to talk about, I'm happy to do that then. So we're going to talk about mood disorders, anxiety, burnout, psychosis, substance abuse, autism spectrum disorder, and touch on obsessive compulsive disorder. Throughout the talk, I'm going to mention some treatments and prevention strategies. We can definitely dig deeper in the discussion sections as well for that. And then the interactive portion of this is we're going to give you an opportunity to pick one of 6 prompts to, in a small group in a breakout room, discuss privately amongst yourselves, issues you may have had with that topic and ideas and solutions you can come up with. And then we're going to come back together, be able to share some of those things, do a general Q&A, and talk about various things at that level. So I will introduce myself a little bit more. Thank you so much, Rachel, for the amazing introduction. But I did want to emphasize, I am a researcher. I've gone through the PhD process and program. And until last year, when I decided to shift gears and focus on my mental health advocacy work, I was in line to become a tenure track research faculty. So I started research when I was an undergraduate in biochemistry and molecular biophysics, studying proteins at the molecular level. My PhD was in molecular and cell biology, focusing on neuroimmunology, and my postdoc, as was mentioned, is in psychiatric epidemiology. So I have 16 years of brain and behavior research from molecules to populations. And I love academia. I've had wonderful times. I've been very, very satisfied with my decisions to go into it. And yet, one of the things that has led me down this advocacy path to founding this nonprofit, Dragonfly, is marked by the reality, the tragic reality of our situation, in which mental illness is rampant among our population. And culturally and climate-wise, we're not dealing with it in an appropriate way yet. So back in my PhD days, I helped create a peer-led organization to address mental health problems. And then during my postdoc, I did as well. So about a year ago, this Dragonfly became the logical next step to turn our grassroots efforts into systemic and widespread change within academia. So let's get down to the meat of it, though. So this talk is meant to only be a very brief mental health introduction. We're going to emphasize depression and anxiety a bit, but we will talk about those other illnesses that I mentioned. And we're hoping that this is really just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about mental illness, mental health literacy, talk a little bit about culture change, and get people thinking about response preparedness. This is not going to be comprehensive knowledge. It's not a response training. It isn't everything you need to know in a nutshell, and it's not a research talk. So if you want to talk to me about my research, we can do that another time. So I like to begin this talk by mentioning and acknowledging that there is a huge spectrum of what we're calling mental health. And so a mentally healthy state really is, the nice, resilient place where you're doing well, you're not stressed, you aren't, you're able to deal with and handle all the things that you naturally or unexpectedly kind of encounter in your day-to-day life. Most of us would like to be in a mentally healthy state. All these individual resiliency type trainings are trying to cultivate more of this state. Stress is something, though, that everybody experiences, especially if you go into a PhD, especially if you go into higher education or a research type career. So there's good stress and there's bad stress. And both of those things are just part of life. And you can use the good stress to, improve, get better at what you're doing, better at relationships, home life, work life, whatever it is. But, usually you can move from that stress state, a period of short-term stress, back into a mentally healthy state with relative ease. The next kind of level of this mental health spectrum is something we would call distress. So this is a level of distress, level of stress that is maybe lasting a really long time, or it's impacting your life in a more negative way than just normal stress. And it's harder to get from that distress state back to the mentally healthy state. But it's not a disease yet. It doesn't meet the criteria as a disease, mental disease of, it doesn't meet that diagnosable criteria. And so while you still might need more intervention, maybe psychotherapy would help move you back to that mentally healthy state. Maybe just changing your diet or changing your environment or taking a break, going on vacation will help you move from that distress state to a mentally healthy state. Whereas disease is more, usually requires more clinical intervention. So speaking to your doctor, coming up with psychotherapy, medication, or behavioral changes that you need to make, or identify the underlying physiological cause of the illness. So that can also be something that happens. And then the worst aspect of mental health spectrum is when someone's in crisis. And so if someone's in crisis, it's that they no longer can handle almost, any certain day-to-day things that they need to be able to handle. Emergency intervention really is critical. And so what we're going to focus on today, which I don't think is really discussed very frequently within the academic community, we tend to focus only on the crisis response or kind of on that mental health stress distress level. So this, I'm going to take the opportunity to dig a little deeper into the real situation that we have. A lot of folks in academia that end up in a disease state. So the final point on this slide and the spectrum is, even if someone has a chronic mental disease, such as depression or bipolar disorder, they can have that disease and, if managed well, still be in a mentally healthy state. So I do want to emphasize that just because you have a disease doesn't mean you are always in that, that you can't live a good and happy and productive life. So I'll start, and we're going to talk about a bunch of different diseases, so I'm using some broad terms here, but it's important to know what makes it a disease and not one of these other points on the spectrum. And so the first thing is that symptoms have to be consistent, not necessarily constant, for more than a reasonable time. So for something like depression or anxiety, usually that reasonable time is a 2-week period. For things like post-traumatic stress disorder, to meet criteria for that, the symptoms have to last, longer, months, in order to meet that particular type of criteria for that particular disorder. But for depression, if anyone has experienced depression, such as myself, that it can last a lot longer than 2 weeks, sometimes months. And if people are not seeking treatment, which is pretty common, they can tolerate it for or be suffering with it for years. So this is a general overview. The second big piece is that these must represent a significant change in the person's normal experience upon onset. So if someone's had their first depressive episode when they were a teenager, but never received or sought care, it may not seem like a big change if they've still been dealing with it years and years later, but it is different. They weren't always that way. And so it does need to be recognized as a change in the person's normal experience. And the third, and to me, the most important aspect here is that social, occupational, educational, or other important functioning must be negatively impacted by these changes. So there are some people that have OCD or have bipolar disorder that don't experience a negative impact from these, what would otherwise be a, meet these criteria. And so if they're able to manage it, deal with it, and it's not affecting them in a negative way, then it doesn't meet this criteria. It's not technically a disease. The other thing I want to, again, on a broad view, let you know and make sure that everyone walks away from this knowing is that mental diseases are real biologically and environmentally driven illnesses, just like any other illness we really experience. So it can be episodic, it can be chronic, or it can be a singular event that only happens once in someone's life. And the vast majority of these are preventable and or highly treatable. And one of the things that we've found from epidemiological research is that critical to a mentally healthy climate really is the climate and culture, the care and community support that someone is receiving and is surrounded by. So that's why Dragonfly really focuses on the community discussion and engagement part of this topic, mental health in academia, the culture and the climate, and how everyone knows about and thinks about and talks about mental illness or mental health struggles anywhere on the spectrum is really, really critical, really important. So now we're going to dig in, and I will have to hold myself back. Mood disorders are my specialty, so I'll go brief, but again, in the larger group discussion, we can dig a little deeper. So the mood disorders and anxiety are, so depression and bipolar disorder are both considered mood disorders. They're the two most common, and anxiety is what we call highly comorbid. So the term comorbidity just means that they often happen at the same time in the same person. And so anxiety can exist on its own, though, without any symptoms of depression or bipolar depression. And so these are all taken together. These are the absolutely most common, illnesses that people are going to meet criteria for, and especially in academia. So in the general population, there's about a lifetime prevalence of maybe 20% for depression. That means at some point in someone's life, about 20 to maybe up to 30, depending on the study, of people will have had one episode of depression at some point. But if you survey the general population right now in this moment and ask them about the previous 2 weeks and their mood and their symptoms, about 6.7% would be positive or would have met criteria for depression or bipolar disorder. For anxiety, it's just a teensy bit lower, maybe about 6% in the general population. So the reason why we're kind of emphasizing this in this particular talk is that what we're finding from studies that are now finally being done is among graduate students, this is much, much higher than the general population. So 39% of respondents to a survey published in Nature in 2018 tested positive, essentially, or screened positive for depression during that during that exact period of time. That's 6 to 8 times higher than the general population. And anxiety, the 41% met criteria for moderate to severe anxiety. So, one of the things that I end up talking about, and I'm personally motivated by, is that I've lost 2 classmates and colleagues to suicide and depression. And the reason why we're not really talking about or focusing on suicide itself is that what we do know is that about 80 to 90% of suicides are due to an underlying untreated mood disorder, or not treated well enough mood disorder. And so by treating the underlying mood disorder, that is the most effective way to prevent suicide. However, if you do happen to know someone who's acutely suicidal, please, take that as a very serious red flag, very serious. Try to get them to an emergency service or to call an emergency suicide hotline in order to find out what they can do. And then the other 2 really important things if someone's acutely suicidal are to restrict means of completing a suicide and or attempting one, and avoiding substance use. So this is really, really important. Having substances like alcohol or cannabis on board can increase impulsivity and increase the likelihood that someone may make an attempt. So for depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety, all of these actually affect all kinds of things, not just the mood of the person. So the mood, the person's body and their behavior can change. And then one of the most disturbing things, especially for academics such as ourselves who are using our minds are our instrument for what we do, it can alter your thoughts. And so we end up calling that thought disorder. When someone suddenly becomes, cognitively so slow, their brain doesn't seem to be working at the way it used to, or they end up with racing, worried thoughts that they cannot get out of their head. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to talking about the pandemic. And the causes are multifactorial. So one of the interesting things about depression in particular, but also bipolar disorder and anxiety, is that it may not necessarily be, it may be a bit more of a feature of our biology, not a bug. And it's just when and for how long these kinds of signs and symptoms come on, that is the disordered part. It's like a broken thermostat or something. And there's actually, it seems to be a lot of different roots to the same set or cluster of symptoms. So you can have immune and endocrine dysfunction lead to depression or anxiety. You can have nutrition, sleep or exercise deficiencies lead to this. You can have probably anyone who is more familiar with depression might be familiar with the SSRIs, or the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So we do know that we can modulate serotonergic pathways in the brain and create change in certain individuals, positive change. And we do know that there's a fair amount of genetics, as well as a very big player of experienced trauma, either as a youth or during childhood, or during adulthood. Trauma really increases the chances of developing these disorders. So I spent the most time on this topic, and we'll go a little quicker through the other ones. But we do want to, I do want to emphasize that if you're experiencing, or if you know someone who's experiencing these kinds of symptoms or issues, it does not spell the end of your career. None of these do. There are many academics and successful researchers around the world that, that have and manage these illnesses. So Professor Kay Jamieson is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and she's the world's expert on bipolar disorder and has bipolar disorder. She wrote an incredible manuscript memoir called An Unquiet Mind that I highly recommend checking out. So next we're going to talk about burnouts, and we're putting this right after depression because it's similar. There's some overlap in symptomology, but they're different, and they're different causes, as well as different, might require different interventions in order to correct for them. So burnout is emotional or physical exhaustion, reduced resilience and adaptability, usually an increase in cynicism about work and colleagues potentially, and typically includes reduced performance and concentration. And the causes of burnout, different from depression, which can have a whole myriad of causes, is that it's chronic stress relating specifically to work and maybe sometimes other ongoing activities. It's a sense of lack of control. It often is due to bullying or toxic work environments and relationships. And usually really you can come back to pointing at a bad work-life balance. And there's a lot of research that's been done on burnout recently in the last several years. And what we know is taking breaks or vacation is essential for reducing and ameliorating burnout. Negotiating better hours or accommodations, or improving your communication with your boss or your colleagues. You have to get to the root of what is initiating the burnout. And seeking support and building better relationships, specifically at work, is really, really helpful. And then this is something that does respond really well to mindfulness, improved sleep, and increased exercise. So psychosis is something that is one of the most, it's not particularly common, but it is one of the most probably disturbing things to either experience yourself or to see someone that you know or work with experiencing. But the symptoms are when someone becomes disconnected from reality, increase kind of bizarre behavior that they didn't used to do, and the development of delusions. So delusions are strongly fixed beliefs that don't really make sense given the context or the situation for other people. And it can also include hallucinations. So this is something that has been shown in the media a little bit more. A Beautiful Mind, showed someone who had a psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, and it indicated that he had visual hallucinations. But in fact, John Nash had auditory hallucinations only. He was hearing people's voices. And so people can experience hallucinations that are tactile and sensory, auditory, or visual. So these are all things that people can experience that no one else is experiencing. And then one of the biggest indicators of this to outside people is that psychosis usually comes with a little bit more chaotic or incoherent speech. And especially during this time where we're not seeing people as much, it might come through in their writing. So in the general population, as well as in academia, about 1% of people will meet criteria at some point for a psychotic disorder. And the causes are really known to be highly genetic. There's a lot of genetic predisposition. So twin studies have shown us that about 50% of the likelihood of someone developing a psychotic disorder seems to come from the genetics. And that means 50% comes from environmental triggers that are a lot more difficult to tease apart what exactly those might be. You can also induce psychosis through extreme sleep disturbance. And substance use or withdrawal from certain substances can also induce psychosis. And it can also accompany other disorders such as bipolar mania or borderline personality disorder. And when they're in the context of one of these other illnesses, they're usually called psychotic features. The good thing about psychosis, which I don't think enough people really know, is that there are really good treatments that can get people back to that mentally healthy state where they can engage in their day-to-day life, their relationships and their work. And so antipsychotics, psychodynamic therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy are all really, really effective, especially if people start engaging in that care as soon as they start experiencing symptoms, as opposed to try to hide them and avoid dealing with them. It does tend to get worse if not treated. And I do want to emphasize here too, psychosis is not the end of a career. Professor Ellen Sachs wrote a memoir. She's a university professor, law professor down in Southern California, and she wrote a book called The Center Cannot Hold. And she's amazing. It's an incredible book. So, experiencing these things, while they can be very scary in the moment, are treatable, dealable, and you can go on to continue to be an academic and conduct excellent research. So substance use disorders. The symptoms of substance use becoming a disorder is daily use, binge behavior, if someone's experiencing blackouts due to their substance use, if they're lying about their use, if they have maybe cravings or they're using that and it's impacting their work, their relationships, their friendships, or if they're using so much that it's impacting their mental or physical health. And this is one that is really such a tragic situation because it's so highly stigmatized. Substance abuse, addiction are things that are a mental illness. And, I said for psychosis, it's about 50% genetics. there are studies that suggest that it's 40 to 60% genetics in that leads to people and predisposes people to become addicted to substances, to end up having a substance use disorder. And so a lot of people will actually use these substances that you can get legally or illegally as coping behavior. Or maybe self-medication, but they tend to make things, especially mental illnesses, much, much worse. And so the unfortunate issue is that we have a lot of social pressure. There's often easy access. And then for those who are predisposed to developing an addiction, that leads to dependence. And there's a lot of overlap between substance use disorders, and mental illnesses. They co-occur or they're comorbid quite frequently. Again, though, the great thing about these illnesses is that there's treatments that are highly effective. And so detoxification programs, support groups to maintain that sobriety, and individual or group counseling and peer support is highly effective in dealing with substance use disorders. Treatment of the co-occurring mental health disorder, if say someone has depression and they developed a substance abuse disorder in addition to that, you do have to treat both at the same time if possible. So autism spectrum disorder is a little bit of a different thing because a lot of the other ones we've talked about have adult onset, whereas autism spectrum is actually a complex developmental condition that involves a persistent challenge in social interaction, speech and nonverbal communication, and restricted or repetitive behaviors. And so there are a fair number of people who are on the autism spectrum who do not have what would meet criteria for a disorder. So I do want to emphasize that that is certainly true. But the causes of autism spectrum disorder, really we're still challenged to understand the causes. We do know that or can link about a quarter of cases to novel mutations. And there's another 3/4 that either there's some indicator that maybe there's some multigenic risk. So there's many different polymorphisms or mutations across the genome that are contributing to the risk or development of autism, or unknown. We really can't find it. So it's an interesting, autism spectrum is very interesting to study and look at. And I think in the next few years, we're going to learn a lot more. But one of the other reasons I bring up autism spectrum disorder is that people who are, on the autism spectrum actually have increased risk of developing some of these other illnesses that we've talked about and will talk about. So depression is much higher. ADHD can be more common. OCD, which we haven't talked about yet, can be more common as well. And so what helps is if someone has both, treating the secondary illness is really, really helpful. So medication treatment for depression, ADHD, or OCD can really improve someone's life. For the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder itself, psychotherapy, occupational or educational therapy, and especially sensory integration therapy are all really good for this. And, for autism spectrum and successful professors, I think this is one where there's a very, very prominent person, Professor Temple Grandin, who Oliver Sacks wrote a memoir about, an anthropologist on Mars. And so she's a very famous professor who's done incredible things in the animal industry. So check that out. And if you're interested, Twitter has a hashtag autistics in academia to connect with other folks who experience this as well. So obsessive compulsive disorder is the last one. And the symptoms, oh, sorry, that was my phone. Just randomly talking to me. So the symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder are a strong urge to perform certain routines or rituals. This is the compulsion part. And unwanted repetitive thoughts or maybe intrusive fears. And so that's the obsession. And so this can cause people experiencing these things to spend up to hours a day, potentially, performing physical or mental rituals that can lead to avoidance of triggers or people. And the causes are, again, multifactorial, but we know that there's a fair amount of genetics involved. There's a lot of trauma, especially childhood trauma, that can increase the likelihood of someone developing this, but not necessarily. And we all are also seeing that there are potentially some brain structural differences. So this may be also due to some developmental kind of conditions. And so I bring up OCD specifically because in the general population, it's about 1% of folks who will have meet criteria for OCD. Whereas there are some studies that indicate, especially in engineering that and STEM fields, that the rates of OCD can be 3 or more times that. So 3.5% of the population surveyed in one study found that there's an enrichment of OCD within our academic communities. So again, it's wonderful that we have great treatments that help. Cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response prevention, and certain medications really work quite well to help mitigate the negative aspects of OCD. And there's someone, Dr. Nadine Mueller, who has a website that I've got here that you can also check out, who talks very openly and wonderfully about her experience as an academic with OCD. So we're going to hit those big points again. So, 80% of major depressive episodes respond to standard treatment. It may not be the first treatment you try, but, without the majority do. And a lot of these other illnesses, it might take a little bit of time to figure out what the right approach is for that individual. But we have a lot of tools in our arsenal to help people who are struggling with these things. What we found is that awareness, early identification, and early treatment are really key in improving outcomes. And so it's really tragic, but the average person waits 6 to 8 years to seek treatment for depression or bipolar disorder. The onset of symptoms, especially for folks that have a high capacity, have a good ability to mitigate for some of the negative aspects, hide or cover up or push through, have high resiliency, will ignore very serious and concerning and treatable symptoms for a long time, which usually makes the disease worse and more difficult to treat later on. And then, as I mentioned before, community support and encouragement is hugely impactful. Having that community, having lower or no stigma in your community around these things really increases sustained treatment engagement and improves overall outcomes. So I'll reemphasize that graduate students have 8 times higher rates of severe depression and anxiety than the general population. This is a real issue for us. And I'm sure, while they were studying graduate students, based on what we know and the experiences I've had, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't magically go away after graduate school. And there's another couple of few studies that indicate that those with higher IQ and educational attainment report higher rates of mood disorders and yet are less likely to seek treatment than the general population, than their peers. And so, these are issues that we need to address and look at within our community. And we know that postgraduate education has some unique aspects to it. So on university campuses, there's more and more wellness programs, which are great, but they tend to be less effective for graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and faculty. And we know, all of you I'm sure know, that there are cultural and systemic barriers that really, prevent graduate students and other academics from seeking support. Maybe through shame or embarrassment, or thinking that they really need to take care of it themselves, that they should be able to do that. Or they're worried that maybe medication or psychotherapy would either be a waste of time or cause more problems than, say, the depression or the mental illness is causing them already. There's a lot of these beliefs that I've heard over the years. And we also know that postgraduate education and faculty positions come with unique pressures and extreme stress. This is something that a lot more people are talking about, which, these systemic issues are not a personal issue. We have to address both. And so I do want to take one more minute and emphasize that, while we're all experiencing all of, the stresses of academia, there are people who have different additional stresses, or what we call minority stress, that women, people of color, people who are LGBTQ plus, who are first generation students, are people with disabilities, are international students, they're experiencing additional stressors that if you don't belong to that group, you may not be privy to and aware of what their impact is. And when people belong to more than one of these groups, the stresses and risks combine, often with much more than an additive negative impact. And so I'll end with a comparison that I like to make, is between elite athletes and academics. The best athletes in the world train incredibly hard. They give their all to achieve this peak performance in their field. But when there's an injury, even the smallest one, the response is to address it immediately, even courtside, for the whole world to see. And we are privileged to be able to train our minds at the highest level as scientists, as researchers, as engineers. And yet, when our minds, the most critical instrument for our work, is injured or strained, we tend to just keep doing what we're doing. And some studies, as I mentioned, indicate most people on average will wait 6 to 8 years. Academics seem to wait even longer, and this should change. So, we had a little bit of intro, so it's 9:16, and I'm gonna go a little quick through this part, just to make sure we have plenty of time for you to discuss with your small groups a little bit about the pandemic. So, as I'm sure you all know, a lot has changed. Physical contact with other family members, friends, working from home, temporary unemployment, stop of maybe wet lab or in the lab kind of research activities. And for a lot of folks, homeschooling of children has really caused a lot and a lot of change. And most people, probably 75% of academics that we've engaged with have said they're worse off. And the pandemic impacts on mental health, there have been numerous studies now at this point that indicate that there's a lot of negative psychosocial outcomes, including depressive symptoms, anxiety, anger, stress, post-traumatic stress, social isolation, loneliness, and stigmatization. And so there's a lot of negative mental health consequences to this pandemic. I encourage you to check out, if you're interested in getting some numbers on how COVID-19 has impacted people in general, based on age groups. The UK COVID-19 social study run by the University College London surveyed has been following 90,000 respondents. And what we're seeing is that both depression and anxiety are much, much higher than previous to the pandemic, and different age groups are affected differentially. So for those graduate student age groups and postdoc age groups, 18 to 29, or maybe early career stage faculty, 30 to 59, these are much higher rates for those age demographics. And so while we know kind of what acute stress is supposed to do, and it's adaptive typically in your body, chronic stress puts pressure on our bodies in a way that, it's there all the time. We want to do something, but fight, flight, or freeze isn't an option. There's nothing to really be done. And So when the sympathetic nervous system is on chronically, we end up feeling anxious and agitated in a permanent manner. And so the main aim to do is to try to manage your environment to minimize anxiety triggers and to maximize anxiety experiences. And so I'll skip this, but I'll provide the slides for anyone who would like to have them about what recommendations can be done, because I do want to let us break out into the rooms for discussion. So there's lots of things, but I think talking to your colleagues may be one of the best things. So I'll stop here and hand this the slide and the screen back over to Rachel to give instructions for what we're going to do for the breakout rooms.
Wow, thank you so much, Wendy. I learned a ton again, and I'm just so grateful that we're able to have this conversation at a conference. So I am going to share my screen in a moment.
Oh, and thanks to the folks who are sharing the links to the books I'm mentioning. That's awesome.
Yeah, let us know if we missed anything.
Love it.
We're going to share a link to a resource page that we made later on in the talk as well. All right, so you see my screen okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Good. Great. Moving on to the next section of our workshop. Here is a set of 6 different themes and topics that we crowdsourced and compiled before this event. So we're going to move into random breakout rooms, I think with 3 people per room. We'll see how that goes. And so once you're in a room, the idea is as a group, select one of these 6 topics that you wish to discuss together, and then discuss some of the key issues and challenges surrounding the topic, and then some of the solutions and strategies that you come up with in your personal life, in your research environment, and something you want to do moving forward. So the topics are culture change and support structures, self-advocacy in academia, confronting failure and rejection, imposter syndrome, burnout and setting boundaries, and then more general, just like normalizing mental health within academic contexts and destigmatizing this conversation. So there's also some guidelines shown on the right here for your discussion. In particular, please respect the privacy of folks in the room and do not share their details outside of the room with their permission. We're going to turn off the recording for this part of the event, so don't worry about that. Speak from personal experience when possible, so using I statements and not speaking for others. There's also no expectation or pressure to share what you do not wish to share. And then make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak and share if they would like to. So if you want to link to these questions so that they're visible once we are in our breakout rooms, there's a file on the conference platform. You can also scan this link on your cell phone to bring up the questions. So yeah, without further ado, actually with further ado, one more thing. Within your groups, if you want to pick one person who is going to report what you discussed to the group, and you can do so anonymously in a poll question, or you can do so out loud afterwards. Please do that as well. All right, so I believe Pam is going to set up breakout rooms now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It looks like there's about 12 of us on the call, so maybe we could just have a conversation and stop the recording. What are we thinking? Yes, no, maybe so. Yeah,
Let's
that
have a
looks like yeah.
convo.
Pam, is there a way to stop the recording briefly to discuss our topics?
There certainly is. I can do that. I'm going to go ahead and pause it right now.
Okay,
Thank you, Pam.
thank you. Yeah, so can you see my whole screen? Great, okay. Yeah, so I'll just end the session. Thank you all for coming and contributing to what really seems like important conversations to be having about mental health in academia. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Dragonfly and what we do, and then invite you to engage with us moving forward in whatever capacity, strikes your fancy. So Dragonfly's approach, we realized that our grassroots kind of efforts by students for students kind of approaches within a single university or a single department really just weren't cutting it. And so we formed this global organization in order to make some real change, hopefully. And we do this through three main ways. One is through research. So as we've discussed, we do have some numbers about academia and the mental health issues, but we don't have enough. And we need to do more of that. And we need to have more evidence-based approaches and knowledge about what really does help for our particular populations. We also are working to build a worldwide community to change the way we talk about and see mental health and how it's influenced, and impacts our work as academics. And so we have something called Dragonfly Cafe, where we have 3 live events a week where you can come together with other academics from around the world, from a myriad of disciplines, and a variety of countries. We've had folks from 6 continents join us, and it's an amazing group of people who also really care about mental health. So it's very casual, but it's a form of peer support, which is great. And then the third piece, which the mental health literacy talk that I delivered today is a portion of, is our on-campus programming. And so we're working to create this cultural and climate change directly in academic and professional associations and communities like this by bringing evidence-based programs to universities. And so I want to take a moment to just emphasize that, it takes a village. It takes an entire massive group of people to change the paradigm of a community and a culture. And so we have, we just started less than a year ago, and we already have 140 volunteers from over 25 different countries. And it's a volunteer-based organization that's nonprofit. And so these people are some of the amazing people that I get to work with on a daily basis. And so what we've come up with is essentially, access to care is really important, and we can help consult with that sort of thing, the clinical care. But what we think is really going to make that climate and cultural change within communities, it involves 5 major pieces of this puzzle, or what we call a wellness wheel. And so departmental committees and peer networks are the people within the institution. And we have, specific ideas and plans and roadmaps for those people and those organizations and how they can function. And then 3 key components that will improve the climate and the culture around mental health. And that's improving mental health literacy, fighting the stigma directly, and improving skills, providing actual skills that people can use on a daily basis, or when they find themselves in a situation that they're not used to dealing with. So all of these are customized for each community. And we know that each community, whether you're in a different country, or you speak a different language, or you're a different, you're in medicine versus material science, every community is unique, and so are their needs. And so we recognize that and customize everything. So just super briefly, for these 5 different kind of pieces of the puzzle, We offer consulting to help set up departmental committees. We also now are going to be launching next year a comprehensive 3-year program where we are, working intensively to bring all 5 of these components to a community that within 3 years, they will be completely self-sustained and have a long-term strategy for how to create and maintain excellent mental health. For peer networks, these can be done as part of the comprehensive program or just separately. And so for students and trainees and folks that don't have access to funds, maybe, we provide free consulting. We have some free webinars already on our YouTube channel. And we've also created a free Slack space for people who are building their own peer networks to cross-communicate and collaborate and talk things out with other folks who are trying to achieve the same things. For mental health literacy, we're ever building our programming. So we have a scientist primer on depression specifically, a scientist primer on mental health, which we delivered today. We have another talk that's more extended about mental health and isolation. I just barely took a couple of slides from that for today. And we're building one on imposter syndrome specifically, as well as mental health and immigration. For fighting the stigma, one of the things that we have discovered is that, improving mental health literacy alone doesn't move the needle on stigma. And so we've started by creating a series of films for specific communities in order to help break the stigma. And we find that curated films and film screenings and then facilitated discussions are what change the stigma around mental health and struggling with a mental health condition. And then finally, our workshops. We have some really great workshops with excellent evidence that it's useful, it's appreciated, and it's immediately usable skills. So one is called Tools for Supporting Student Mental Health. Another is a different version of that, which is active listening training for TAs. So that's more targeted towards PhD students or maybe even postdocs who are teaching. And then another workshop called Managing Up, how to talk to your supervisor to get what you need to excel. So with that, I want to open it back up for anybody who stuck around and wants to keep talking. But here we have a number of links. You can go to our website as well, dragonflymentalhealth.com, and get in touch, request us on the services page, and or just send us a note, and we can set up a time to chat and figure out what we can do to help support you in creating cultural change. So with that, I will completely stop and let's go back to see if there's anybody still here who wants to chat.
I'm going to make 2 real quick announcements first as well. So,
still a lot of people here, yay.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sticking around. Okay, so I wanted to make 2 announcements. So first, we've compiled a page of different resources with links and resources, some from Dragonfly and Dr. Ingram, but also others that have helped us. There's some podcasts, there's some videos, there's some other organizations that are doing similar work, some readings. So if you click on the files section of the conference app, or if you just scan with your phone over this QR code, you can find our list of resources. There's also the 2 recordings from the previous 2 events that we ran during this year's MRS conference. And then lastly, you knew this was coming. We made a survey to get feedback on this session. It's really important if we want to have other sessions like this at MRS in the future, just to hear whether it was helpful for you. So feel free to scan this and fill out the survey or find it in files, and also get in touch if you're interested in organizing something like this in the future, whether it's through MRS or through your own local organization or your institution, whatever. And then lastly, I would really want to thank the the other organizers and the members of the student engagement subcommittee for helping put this event together. So Julia, Eddie, Simi, Eva, and Pam, thank you so much. All right, now let's turn it over to Q&A.
All right, you can raise your hands again or just go ahead and unmute. There's not too many of us, so happy to answer any more questions or hear more about what was discussed in your groups. Elman, did you raise your hand or was that a goodbye?
No, I didn't. Someone was at my door. I'm sorry.
Ah, okay.
We can also read some of the questions from the chat.
Yeah, sure. If there's some there, that would be great.
Okay.
They're asking us to stop the recording.
Okay. Okay, so another question from the audience and shared anonymously. And this is something that came up in my breakout room discussion about setting boundaries and about sort of work-life conversations. So what is the way to embrace and share any mental health issues that we might be suffering to, or I guess within our research group, to our lab mates or any person that we have daily contact, in order to feel free, or so that they can be aware in case of an emergency, but also without feeling weird about it and like overstepping?
I mean, it's a great question and it comes up a lot. And, you know, it relates back to a little bit of what I was working on or referencing in the last question that wasn't recorded, but you know, the parity between, you know, if I have a peanut allergy, it is totally expected and normal for me to say to my lab group, you know, warn them, I have a food allergy. Could you, you know, would it be possible for no one to bring in peanut butter cookies? Or if you do, you know, depending on the severity of the allergy, like if you do, you know, give me a heads up so I don't think it's a sugar cookie, pop it in my mouth and go bleh. Like, you know. And so this it's an interesting lived experience for me because I did have this you know, two different things going on both during grad school, that I had severe allergies that ended up getting much worse, and I ended up needing to go and get allergy shots in order to try to, you know, modify my immune system to be able to handle those environmental triggers. It's just like the other issue that I have, which I struggle with bipolar disorder, environmentally driven, but also genetically, you know, there's these genetic predisposition kind of components to it, both my allergies as well as my bipolar disorder, which, you know, I've got family history of both. And, you know, it involves environmental triggers. And so why can I tell my lab space, you know, I have this peanut allergy and it might kill me, versus, and, you know, I need to leave in the middle of the day on Wednesdays for the next 6 months in order to go get a shot, be gone for an hour and come back. You know, it takes some time. They want to monitor you so you don't have anaphylaxis. And so like, you know, but that is completely acceptable. And yet, you know, I was very uncomfortable revealing my mental health status and pointing out or revealing certain things that trigger me. We had someone in the lab who liked to yell. And that was just, it was her. It was something that, you know, in general, people might say is not professional and shouldn't exist in a lab in the first place. But, you know, it was very triggering for me and would make me withdraw quite a bit and exacerbate my depressive episodes if I was already kind of going that direction. But I felt, you know, not comfortable at all at the time revealing that and asking her to please make this accommodation for me. And so, you know, so I recognize that it does feel different and it sucks that it feels different. And so part of what can create a better environment, both for us as individuals, so for me, it was exploring these topics, changing my own self-stigma around the difference between these two, being confident in the fact that they are equivalent and they should be treated equivalent both by myself and by others. And yet, you know, it depends on what your environment and your group is too. And so if it's a hostile environment that really clearly is signaling that mental health conditions are not tolerated and are not respected as equivalent to physical health conditions, then you might want to make the decision to be vague or even misdirect and kind of point, come up with, I have a physical health condition, or be, it's none of their freaking business. It's a health condition. Leave it at that. So, and one of the things that's been really interesting about bringing these talks and these, workshops in, where we ask faculty and students to reflect on, what's your response when I say somebody has these needs and this kind of condition, but someone has essentially equivalent needs, but it's for a different condition and it's mental health condition. What's that self-stigma? Like, what's that reflection? What's going on there? Doing that as a group, getting people to talk about it and discuss it can really reveal a lot of folks that to themselves that they didn't recognize that they had this kind of stigma. And then they can, maybe change their behavior or be more thoughtful about it and mindful about it. Or there are folks that, don't see them as different or non-equivalent, but they feel hesitant to speak about the mental health stuff. And so they're accidentally making it seem like a hostile environment when it's not. So that ended up being the case for me as a grad student. Was my PI was never asked me how I was, never asked me, especially if I was like distressed after the lab mate started screaming, or didn't show up for a couple of days, she never asked. And to me, I interpreted that silence as intolerance. And then after the fact, it became obvious. We ended up having, a heart-to-heart my senior year. And she was like, oh yeah, I struggle with depression all the time. I didn't want to invade your privacy. And I was like, dang it. Just to summarize, it's like, you do have to assess the situation. You do have to work on your own confidence in the fact that you have every right to seek the care that you need for mental, physical, emotional well-being. If they're hostile overtly, try to assess that. But if you're not getting any signals, be a little curious about what that means. Is it hostility, or is it their avoidance and worry about overstepping your boundaries? So you can kind of test those waters in some sneaky ways sometimes.
Yeah, thank you.
Chloe.
Looks like Chloe had a question as well.
Sorry, it's actually not a question. I wanted to add on to what you just said about your own advisor not really taking the initiative to ask about you. That's a huge thing. I think most people in academia don't have training on how to be an effective mentor. That was a workshop series that I took at my...
Oh, you got muted. Somehow.
Sorry, that was me.
Oh.
I was just like, I took this mentorship workshop and it was really eye-opening for me because I have an undergrad student. And like, I never see myself as being intimidating, but to an undergrad, like I am. So it was really eye-opening, and it started changing my conversations with her. And I started asking open-ended questions like that. How are you? Is there anything going on with work that you want to share with me? What kind of challenges are you facing? And yeah, just in general, I think with power dynamics, when like whatever point that you're at in your lab, I would try to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody at the same level as you that you trust. And like, that'll help you kind of gauge your lab culture. And if they're open to it, then you can kind of spread more out there, and like, it'll be a little safer than like, I don't know, theoretically announcing it at group meeting or something.
Yes.
But
those
yeah,
are great strategies.
And recognizing that if you do have an undergraduate, or if you're a postdoc and you have graduate students or even a faculty member, I think being open about your mental illness can be really, really powerful. My own advisor, once I told her about some of the challenges I was going through, shared some of her own. And it honestly made a huge difference for me, because it was like, you're an incredible researcher and you've dealt with this. Like it makes me feel like, I can get through it and be successful too.
Yeah, and that internal community support is like, revealing is so awesome. So, I'm coming from like molecular biology and public health, and we've done a whole series of interviews and published a couple online on our YouTube channel of these interviews with prominent faculty at Johns Hopkins and UC Berkeley, and for within that community, those are recognizable, incredible people, and having them openly talk about depression or anxiety or even suicidal ideation, like it's so powerful to be like, okay, but you still got where you are. Oh, okay. It shifts that paradigm. And so we really encourage that. And so this is a different community, and I would be more than happy to work with anyone on this call that's interested, to put out a call to faculty or prominent scientists, and community members, to make a film like that, maybe for next year, or maybe an interim, even. So I think hearing from your own community members and those people at those high levels and high achievement, that totally changes the whole scape of everything and makes it a lot more, both relatable, okay, it reduces that stigma, and it also gives students and, whatever level you're at, the opportunity to be like, oh, did you see that film put together by MRS, about so-and-so? Like, I never would have guessed that so-and-so had depression. What do you think? And you can test those waters that way. And if they reveal like, well, that's ridiculous, or yeah, I really am glad that they were open about that, or, you can get a sense more so that way. It's also a tool to get a sense of, somebody in particular, like your mentor or your lab group's, sense of tolerance and awareness and stigma.
So we have about 5 minutes left in the session. I can ask another question, or
I have a question.
yeah, go for it.
So actually, I'm always wondering, it goes, so unfortunately, I missed all the breakout rooms because I was in another MRS panel. I'm sorry for that. But so from what I heard when coming back, this importance of like, the more seniors are suffering in a similar way, or my classmates are suffering in the same way. So I'm frankly speaking, always surprised, or I'm wondering, do you think that students at the moment, they speak less to each other than they maybe used to speak 20 years ago to each other? Are they shyer to share their worries, to sit together and gossip about their professors and get angry collectively to get rid of this? Because this is something I did when I was a student a lot. I mean, it was not like sugarcoating all the time. Of course, we were stressed, but we had a strong like community. So I'm wondering whether there is like more shyness among the students at the moment to speak to actually their group members, or whether there are higher expectations maybe imposed by parents or by the general society of always functioning perfectly.
You bring up some really interesting points. So, things definitely have changed as far as pressures go, and anticipation and expectations, and the competitiveness of the field. So people's, CVs, curriculum vitae, when they apply for faculty positions, often now have to be like, you're not even considered if you don't have a Nature, Cell, or Science paper, or you don't have at least 15 papers that are all considered influential in your field, or, whereas, in chats that I've had, obviously, I'm a younger, earlier career researcher, but I've had a lot of chats now with faculty that are, even emeritus at this point, or, Nobel laureates and people who have great success or well-known, and kind of all along that spectrum. And I always ask this question, I'm like, what do you experience has changed? What's been going on? And so I think there's an interaction between exactly what you were saying, both whatever the current or the individual's kind of culture is, as well as the absolutely unequivocally increasing standards and pressure and expectations. So I was talking to, we interviewed Randy Sheckman, who's a Nobel laureate in medicine, and he, so he and I were discussing both of these things. And I asked him when he revealed to me, we just interviewed him about his own lived experience with panic attacks during his like mid-20s, when he was already an assistant professor. And at the time I was 34 and was like, I'm 34 and just finishing my first postdoc, and this is standard. So, there's these interactions. And, for him personally, he was trained in a culture where he only told his wife and his best friend about these, arguably really life-shatteringly scary events of like panic attacks can be very terrifying. And, he only told 2 people, and I asked him why, and he said, it was, you don't talk about that. Like, certainly not in a professional setting. And that was what he was trained at that time in that particular environment. So there's an interaction of those 2 things for sure. My impression from my kind of field and study and everything, as a graduate student, we talked a ton with each other, but also we didn't talk about how many of us were in counseling until our colleague died by suicide and depression. So so there's both. So it depends on the culture, it depends on the climate. What I'm finding, and I know we're at the end, is that many more people are now seeming to be more comfortable speaking about mental health struggles, issues, things that are contributing to those. And I think that's a good thing, and it's a good trend. So I hope that keeps up.
Thank you. So it's 10:30, so I'm going to close this event. I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Wendy Ingram and to Dragonfly Mental Health for leading this workshop. We're so grateful for your time and your work, and just your work to normalize wellness, to talk about these things, to share your lived experience and empower us academics with this talk and with all the resources that you shared. And thank you everybody else for participating in this workshop. And again, please fill out the survey and don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or want to get involved with organizing and advocacy work surrounding mental health in academia. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Please, anybody who wants to reach out.